Excellent. So, Sunil, you're on the other side, right? Sort of helping firms report. So, what's your role, and how do you do that?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to thank you, Hans, and Jeffrey and Peter for hosting this event, and thank you for having us here. I think you asked the question, how did I get here, or how did we get here, and what do we do? I got here by accident. I spent 15 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers, over 10 as a global managing partner and the chief strategy officer for the firm at Pricewaterhouse, and then ran a couple of global businesses. I couldn't spell sustainability. And the transition was quite interesting. In terms of what we do as a firm, AccountAbility is a firm that has been around for 25 years. It was formed as the Institute for Social and Ethical Accountability for England and Wales 25 years ago. So it's gone through a few transitions. What we do is basically, we're an advisory and a standard-setting firm that focuses exclusively in the area of sustainability. Our typical clients are Fortune 500 clients, governments of certain states, and multilateral organizations, the World Bank, IMF, UNDP, etc. And we work with them in two ways. Obviously, when you get a phone call, if someone has spilled some oil or someone has had a bad trade, that's a different kind of work. But the better kind of work is the more proactive work where you help companies work on developing strategies, putting these strategies in place, putting in a balanced scorecard with metrics, putting in programs that they have in place. And it stretches entirely across the E, S, and G spectrum. And one thing to keep in mind, it is very much an idea whose time has come. I was a skeptic. And a lot of friends from my investment banking world, the strategy world, joked at me that I was going to atone for my sins now that I had performed 15 years of them. But I've been a careful and a deliberate convert, not to the point that I still drive a Prius or anything of that sort. I still drive 12-cylinder vehicles, and I love red meat and red wine, but I think there's a balance. It isn't about not making money, it is about making money responsibly. And there's a difference, right? And it's very interesting when you look at it, the pressures. I think there was a survey that was done recently by Deloitte. It was called the Deloitte Millennial Survey. Almost 90% of millennials consider the success of a company in more than just financial terms. So those are your employees of the future. When you look at consumers, over 80% or 81% of global consumers want to make informed choices of buying goods and services that are more than just a functional acquisition. This was an Accenture survey. And they want to make a difference. I just gave a talk at MIT Sloan School, my alma mater, and we went through the Career Development Office and their statistics. And it's been over 20 years, so it was pretty depressing for me anyway, 20 years later, to see them. And you looked at the top 3 reasons why young women and men want to join companies in the future. Number 1 was we want to work for a company with a purpose. Number 2, there was a multiple choice. It was just a tick mark. Number 2, we want to work for a company with values. Now, guys like me used to say the most valuable company in the stock market, and that's the one I choose, but it was values. And the third one is something that a lot of us in this room can testify to. It was something I hadn't heard of before. It's called, Peter, work-life balance. What's that? Right? So this is how the world has changed, and we help in advisory services and standards. Our standards are more like principles. They're industry agnostic. They can be used by a wide variety of industries, organizations of different sizes. Different principles around stakeholder engagement, assurance of non-financial information, and standard principles.
We typically looking at this setting, which is like it's a lot of voluntary reporting, right? So I was actually wondering if, certainly add in on everything, but like, can you tell us something about what's driving the choice? Because of course, as researchers, we want to know the effect of disclosure, but why do companies choose to report on these issues?
Well, yeah, I'll get to that. And first of all, I do agree with what Bonnie and Gerben have said, but I think there's a slight distinction. I think investors drive this debate, but I think there are several other stakeholder groups that have become very vocal and visible and material to this debate. And whether you look at consumers, whether you look at employees, whether you look at regulators, whether you look at media pressure and reporting, so there are other forces that drive this pressure cooker. But clearly, the ESG community and the analyst community and the investment community is paying heed to this. Part of this is where is this going and why, all right? Where this is going, if you look at any sample, if you look at the S&P 500, in 2011, there were less than 20% of companies that produced a form of a sustainability report. In 2018, there are 86%, as of December 31st, 2018, 86% of companies doing that. Now, it has to be for more than just investors. It has to be for a broader spectrum of stakeholders. Similarly, when you look at, and I can quote an HSBC survey, there's a lot of material that all of us have about institutional investors and companies having some kind of an ESG policy in place. But I think the important thing is also what do they report against? And that's turning out to be a problem. Because when you asked about voluntary reporting standards, in the last 10 years, the amount of voluntary reporting standards have gone up from 10 to 182 across all industries. So what does this mean? This means there's going to be some shuffling in that space. And we predict, based on our work with Fortune 500 companies, helping them improve their ESG performance as such so that they can perform better on these indices, we see three things happening. We see consolidation, we see industry specialization, and we see some sort of, not mandated, maybe a strong word, but compliance as in reporting requirements. In terms of consolidation, there are just going to be 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 big players that emerge out of this flux. SASB, IIRC, TCFD, whether it's GRI, ISO, I'm not quite sure what it is, but SASB looks to be the strongest. And I've yet to collect my check from him at the end of this talk for the endorsement. But SASB looks the strongest. Why? Because when you have 77 industry sector supplements, when you're well-funded and well-organized, it makes a difference. There's a structured approach to the business. So the second aspect of this is after consolidation of these 4 or 5 big players, there's going to be an industry vertical. There are already many existing standards in the oil and gas with IPICA. There are standards for healthcare. There are standards with GRESB in real estate. So all of these are going to have an emergence, but there has to be something called a convergence. And there's been a recent platform that has started, as you're aware of, with Ian McIntosh, called the Corporate Reporting Dialogue. And the Corporate Reporting Dialogue is to find common ground and report in a standardized form to the extent possible with some of these big players in the ESG space. If you ask me, is there one pivot that might shape reporting in the future, aside from all of what we've discussed? I think that one pivot could be the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure most people, it may be a 50-50 in this room, whether you've even heard of the SDGs. Over 68% of countries around the world have made formal commitments to the SDGs. And over 62% of companies have made similar commitments to the SDGs. And there are 17 of them. There is a prediction that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will create a market, create an actual market of over $12 trillion. $12 trillion by 2030, and 380 million more jobs by 2030. And they're focused in 4 sectors: food and agriculture, health and well-being, cities, and energy and materials, right? And that pretty much covers humanity.
Excellent.
Quick point to what Jeff said, spot on. We've done a survey to see what percentage of chief sustainability officers are either sitting or reporting either directly to a CEO or a member of the executive team. And the number has gone up 3-fold in the last 10 years. So I mean, there's no doubt about that. Secondly, sustainability is now being incorporated into the DNA of a company, into the process of a company. So pretty much, and I often liken it to something, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was this whole thing called Y2K, and he had e-commerce departments and e-commerce divisions, and e-commerce is just commerce today. It just became assimilated into the mainstream of the business. And I think that's pretty much the way where sustainability goes, even in terms of, you have audit committees on boards, you have compensation committees, you have nominating committees. We are seeing, again, there was another, as part of the survey, we did over 72% of the global 250 had a sustainability committee or a subcommittee at the board level. So it's an issue probably whose time has come. The kind of questions our boards of our clients have been asked have been pretty benign so far, but they're intensifying in their pressure. So you have things like conflicts of interest, obvious ones, independence, compensation comes up, but that comes up anyway. It came up before this. And then there are issues that we have that are slightly trickier around FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, anti-money laundering, but you can easily take them to your chief compliance officer and explain that you have codes of conducts, you have guidelines, and you're following the federal sentencing guidelines, so you can get away with that. The challenge starts about when you ask boards about their active engagement, right? Vis-a-vis strategy and the likely impact of the choices that they or their predecessors have made 5 years ago for which the company is paying now. That hasn't happened as yet. So.
I don't think anybody has touched yet on the role of assurance in this process. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about the diversity of measurements that are out there, but what role do you see for the independent assurance of that information?
Well, having come from a background with the Big Four, I think the Big Four had justifiably assumed the initial role of assuring early non-financial reports, but they tended to confine themselves to the environmental health and safety areas, right? And they called them the environmental audits, and they added them as a supplement to the overall audit statement. I think you're seeing more and more of the audit firm, and the logical place for them to belong could be the audit firm. But however, the Big Four have not been classically trained to measure, manage, report, or understand these issues, both at a strategic or a systemic level. Interestingly so, the fastest growing advisory practices within the Big Four are the sustainability advisory practices. Right? That they're the fastest growing. So there is a lot of cross-pollination because of the advisory work that they do, that the assurance or the auditing would be probably provided by similar institutions. The thing is, with a lot of pure consulting firms who advise in this area, they're not interested in assuring statements because it's a very restrictive market. It cuts down the possibility of then advising them, right? So there's a conflict. So if you gave me an assurance, I would say, no, I'd rather not. There's much more money to make in consulting. But when you look at a Big Four, it's a different equation because they're looking at different things.